Call of Duty's origins are interesting, as they were made in direct reaction to the commonplace design decisions and principles that dominated the FPS genre at the time. Only instead of an attempt at following these trends, Call of Duty sought to fill a void within the medium by going against the grain. In the 90s and early 2000s, first-person shooters were mainly synonymous with one thing: power fantasy. It's not that these games were not challenging, no, far from it, but the challenge came from a very specific place. You played a super soldier of some sorts and were pitted against upwards of a dozen enemies by yourself, as you had to manage their different strengths and weaknesses, your weapon's strengths and weaknesses, ammo, the environment, and some combination of health, armor, and shields. Whether you were up against demons in hell, saving the universe from aliens, or mowing down Nazis behind enemy lines, you, the player, were the strongest piece on the chessboard, and thus created an experience centered around empowerment. But what if a first-person shooter threw all that out the window and created an experience of disempowerment? An experience where you, the player, were no stronger than the allies and enemies you were up against. This was the question that Jason West, Vince Zampella, and 20 others would answer as they set out to form Infinity Ward, and eventually release Call of Duty and its sequel, Call of Duty 2, on October 25th, 2005. The game starts off in Soviet Russia, with a comical yet grim setup.
These are potatoes, Comrade Commissar! Why are we using potatoes instead of real grenade?
Because real grenades are valuable! In fact, they are worth a lot more than you are!
Oh, of course, Comrade Commissar, my mistake.
The player is a new recruit in the Soviet army and progresses through a series of missions made up of smaller, bite-sized missions against German forces. The player switches over to fight in North Africa and finally concludes with the liberation of France. From a traditional story perspective, Call of Duty 2 seems to be lacking at first glance. Plot is very thin in this game. Each mission opens up with black and white footage from World War II, with a narrator filling in the player on what is going on in the war in order to give the player enough context for the mission. The real-world footage gives COD 2 a more grounded, realistic, and gritty feel. The game also uses journal entries from the character you play as to also fill in exposition. I can't help but feel like these were just a huge missed opportunity, however. What could have been an opportunity to dig in just a little into the psyche of a World War II soldier, to learn just a little bit about the man behind the gun we were playing as, and explore more of COD 2's anti-war message, is scrapped in favor of delivering more exposition to the player. Some may argue this is to allow the soldier you play as to function as blank slates. This was the trend at the time, and games like Half-Life and Halo Combat Evolved had both used this tactic to their advantage. And while in gameplay I think COD 2 does a great job of this as well, I believe the journal entries could have been an easy place to explore its ideas just a little further. With exposition dumped on the player that often equates to nothing more than traditional military shooter tasks, and characters that have the depth of a leaking kiddie pool, you would kind of expect the story to suck. But I remind you that there are two main ways that games can achieve storytelling. One is by mimicking film, using cutscenes to tell their story as if it was a movie. This is definitely a fine way of telling a story in a game, as it has been used impressively through a variety of fan favorites and critical darlings. However, there is another way to tell a good story in gaming, and that is to use the medium to its advantage, by telling a story in ways that film cannot. Call of Duty 2 is one of my favorite examples of this. Let's take a look at one of my favorite war movies, or movies in general for that matter, Saving Private Ryan. Saving Private Ryan's Normandy beach landing scene is legendary, and for good reason. We see all-out hell unfolding before our protagonist, Captain Miller, as he struggles to rally his men. There's constant shocking but realistic imagery, which gives the viewer insight into what the landing on Normandy may have been like. Now let's take a look at Call of Duty 2's depiction of D-Day. The entire time of the landing, the world is seen through the eyes of the player. Outside of one quick moment when you're getting off your transport that is clearly a callback to Saving Private Ryan, COD 2 keeps the focus on wanting you, the player, to have full control. You are allowed to move freely, thus experience everything naturally and organically. You see hundreds of soldiers climbing ropes and getting shot down. You, the player, have to walk over to the rope, Look up the cliff and understand what dangers await for you at the top. Grab it anyway and climb. When you finally reach the top safely, you are pinned down by German bunker and small arms fire. You have to try to lay down smokes in order to have a small chance of advancing on the bunkers, all while your allies die around you. COD 2's depiction to a passive viewer might seem bland and forgettable. It doesn't have half the spectacle that Spielberg has. However, as most of you know, video games are not a passive medium. The player is the one off the transport, the player is the one climbing the cliff, and the player is the one advancing on enemy bunkers. The fact that the player is the one doing all these things makes all the difference. This phenomenal mission is capped off by Ronald Reagan's speech. Hearing him describe the events of Pointe du Hoc, hearing him talk about grabbing the ropes and climbing, even when rangers were shot down or ropes were cut, is given a whole new feeling when you, the player, just did that. I was given such a better understanding of what the rangers went through and was extremely humbled by the experience. Now, I'm by no means saying that Call of Duty 2's D-Day landing is better, even as good as Saving Private Ryan's. I believe that Saving Private Ryan will most likely always have the definitive landing on Omaha when it comes to art. I'm simply saying that Call of Duty 2 attempted and succeeded in allowing me to experience the iconic event in a way I had never been able to before, and in a way that a film can never do, and that feeling and difference that the D-Day mission gave to me can be expanded to the rest of the game. Players are constantly pitted against the Nazi war machine with poor odds and a hailstorm of bullets. Players have to watch allies and companions be blown up before their eyes, which is only made more disturbing when you know they have a name. Often players will make it through sections only to look around and realize they are a few allies short, and have to continue on with the knowledge that had they used a different strategy or played better, those soldiers would be by your side. There are a few times, however, that the game strays a little further from its contextually grounded focus. Two moments come to mind, one when you hop on an anti-aircraft gun and proceed to shoot down an entire fleet of German fighters. The second is a rather strange mission where you are on a turret. The turret isn't the problem. For whatever reason, the tonal shift is really jarring. Captain Price and McGregor banter back and forth, and the whole section feels kind of goofy and lighthearted.
Just turn the wheel in the direction you want to go! Oh, thank you, sir! It's very helpful, it's very clear now!
Neither of these or any other smaller moments that are similar in nature are distracting enough to hurt the overall experience, but they do stand out a bit and are at least worth mentioning. Despite its anti-war message, COD 2 never forgets to give the player a spectacle. There are many moments in COD 2 that leave the player's jaw drop to the floor as it brings to life massive battles, landscapes, and set pieces. Whether you are fighting alongside your comrades in the Russian winter, fighting through North Africa, or liberating a French town, Call of Duty 2 allows the player to not only see World War II, but experience it. COD 2's commitment to disempowering the player extends to gameplay as well. Every movement and decision must be calculated, because one seemingly minor decision that ends up being a poor one is the difference between your survival or seeing an anti-war quote on your screen. The emphasis to make strong decisions is furthered by pitting players up against dozens of enemies that put pressure on you from all sides, pressing the player into a mistake. Keeping firefights at medium to long range, creating smoke screens to advance, and using height advantages are all strongly encouraged and are key to survival. At first glance, Call of Duty's regenerating health system may not seem like it fits the more grounded approach. Some may have preferred a health pack system like Infinity Ward used in their first outing. However, I stand by it being a good idea to use a regenerating health system. When you combine the sheer amount of fire you're up against and the fact that it's all hit-scan weapons, it's unrealistic to assume that a player could get through this game without taking damage. I find health pack systems work best in games where most, if not all, of the damage a player takes is avoidable. Call of Duty's campaign is the complete opposite of that. The amount of damage you take throughout even a single mission is off the charts. The amount of medkits necessary to make it through even a single encounter would be too much. It would just bog the pace down of the game to stop, take out a med pack, shoot an enemy or two, take another med pack. It would be a complete waste of time. I think switching to a regenerating health system was definitely the right call here. Each weapon class in Call of Duty 2 serves a specific gameplay role, seeing as most of the weapons of the time period lack the ability to multitask. Semi-auto rifles are probably the most balanced guns in the arsenal, however they don't really fall into the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none gun. They are accurate, strong at medium to long range, and do decent damage, so it's not like they're viable in any situation. They are a medium to long range gun, the same way a submachine gun is a close range, or a bolt action is a long range. Limiting the player to 2 weapons forces the player to make distinct and interesting choices, but the system is not perfect. The vast majority of the time you will have an automatic or a pistol for close quarters in one slot, and a rifle, whether it be bolt action or semi-auto, in the other. It really wouldn't make much sense to use any other combination most of the time. Due to this, it lacks the depth or complexity of other two-weapon systems, say the game that made it popular, Halo. Halo's weapons combinations are much more nuanced and open in terms of different strategies. I also wish the differences between the weapons in the same class were a little greater as well. This isn't a huge issue because of the way the campaign is structured. The player will never have to choose between a Lee Enfield and a Mosin Nugent. With that being said, there just isn't enough difference between, say, an M1 Garand and a Gewehr for them to really share a different space within the sandbox, and press the player into making a decision between the two. However, there are some differences, so it's not like the difference is just aesthetic. There is a change in values of damage, rate of fire, accuracy, clip size, and so on that do make each gun feel at least a little different to shoot. The gunplay is a big reason why the game is so fun to play. Aiming down your sight is silky smooth, which is fortunate as the game demands it a large percentage of the time. Hipfire is super inaccurate and is only really viable in extreme close quarters. This choice makes sense though, as it stops automatics from being overpowered in both the campaign and multiplayer. Guns also seem to have a perfect amount of recoil. The result is shooting your way through levels is fast, snappy, and fluid. There are also a few other issues that hold down Call of Duty 2's gameplay, the primary offender being the lack of different enemy types. Obviously, using heavies or tac dogs or a lot of other FPS enemy tropes wouldn't really work here due to Call of Duty 2's historically grounded context. Having a valid excuse, however, doesn't change the overall implications and results. The pacing suffers due to a lack of variety in both enemies and gameplay. The only time Infinity Ward really mixes up the level design is at the halfway point, when the player takes control of a tank. The section is fine, albeit unspectacular, and it really stands as the only change of pace section in the entire game. The objectives the player has to accomplish can also feel repetitive. Hold the line, clear out an area, destroy this tank, destroy these flak guns, etc., etc. It's not like any of these objectives on their own are bad, it's just that the game relies on using them over and over. Just a little too much for my liking. I also feel like Sprint could have helped this game out a bit, especially in the pacing department. Every game has their own experience, and having Sprint or not having Sprint has a different effects on different games and different franchises. My point is that Sprint isn't necessary in all games, only that Sprint would have benefited this particular title. The lack of Sprint is especially noticeable when your enemies and allies can all be seen running while you meander behind. The AI leaves a little to be desired as well. Enemy soldiers charge at you blindly and ally soldiers get in your gun path on too many occasions. They also seem to be completely unaware of enemy grenades, which can lead to laughable deaths. Also, the enemy AI not being the best leads to you probably feeling a little more powerful than I would have preferred. Enemies also chuck grenades at you way too often, and it can be extremely frustrating on higher difficulties. The AI avoids being atrocious by being somewhat serviceable. It just feels a little gamier than you would like. With that being said, however, the game is still very fun to play. It's fast, visceral, twitchy, and intense, but also methodical at times, and even though it's repetitive, it still held my attention for the entirety of its shorter runtime. Graphics are 2005 graphics, there is no way around that. But compared to other games from 2005, COD 2 is pretty good, helped out by some great animations. I don't have a problem with looking past older graphics, but some people do. The texture work is particularly bad in some areas, but Infinity Ward does a great job at making the different locations still feel unique to one another within their graphical style. Sound design gets my nod of approval as well. Guns have a strong punch, and when you combine them with the grenades, explosions, screams of pain, and battle commands, the battlefield and the chaos it instills truly comes to life. It still baffles me how much is going on in the sound department at one time, and how it all comes together and blends seamlessly to immerse the player. As much as sound design helps COD 2's immersion, the presentation is the game's greatest plus in this category. I'm still baffled at how Call of Duty 2 is able to create moments that feel as though they should be scripted, but really aren't. Sure, there is some scripting, but the game almost never feels the need to take control away from the player. Knowing that moments don't necessarily happen to everyone, that you the player are impacting the battlefield, makes COD 2's wow moments that much cooler and more memorable. Call of Duty's presentation is also top-notch, which helps sell the grittier feel and more realistic tone. Black and white World War II footage, the dirt kicked up, and the way injured soldiers writher around as you press on, it all helps to sell the player that they are really participating in the Second World War. I also love how animated allies and enemies are, not only in their lines, but also in the way they interact with the environment and their animations. But it's time to talk about the music, because Call of Duty's epic scope moments would not be as memorable if it was not for the solid, if not excellent, soundtrack. The music is epic for big battles and triumphant at the end of missions, but it strays away from making the mistake of always being in your ear. In fact, the score is used sparingly throughout the game, so it doesn't detract from the more realistic feel of combat, and it is that much more impactful when it does ramp up. The Russian score in particular is a standout, as it just feels so amazing when it revs up in big moments with the choir. The presentation, especially with its sound, commitment, grit, and authenticity, allow COD 2 to shine. I want to disclose the fact that I have limited experience with COD 2's multiplayer, as it is difficult to get full matches going nowadays. I still thought I could share my breakdown of the mode to the best of my ability. While many remember COD 2's campaign fondly, most have forgotten about its multiplayer component, as COD 4 has been crowned the symbolic beginning of COD multiplayer. One reason for this could be COD 2's multiplayer is pretty light on content and features, even for a 2005 title. Call of Duty 2's multiplayer may be bare bones, but that's not a bad thing necessarily. Its simplicity and emphasis on gameplay and skill shines through to this day. With the lack of multi-purpose weaponry, you would expect the balance and importance of weapon choice to carry over from the campaign. However, this isn't exactly the case. Obviously, each weapon still isn't good at multitasking and must be used in its specific role. However, there are a few guns that seem a little overpowered when transitioning to the multiplayer arena. Luckily, the problem isn't that one weapon category dominates, but that individual weapons on specific factions do. The Kar 98K, scoped or unscoped, is an absolute beast for the Germans, while the PPSH's whopping 71-round drum mag makes it an easy choice for close-quarters Russian fights. Easy choices like this hurt COD 2, but it luckily doesn't transcend to every game due to the fact that weapons are locked to what team you fall on. The lone exception being the trench gun, which is the only shotgun and is used by all 4 factions, and it packs a deadly punch at an impressive range for a shotgun, making it an all-too-common choice on smaller maps. But overall, while weapon balance could be better, it's not bad, as players still have to carefully select their tool of destruction and play to its strengths. It's satisfying holding down a building with a sniper, or flanking down a rifleman that's holding down a checkpoint with your sub. And players that use their weapons outside of their intended ranges will often find themselves being punished. COD 2 has 5 game modes. Team Deathmatch and Deathmatch are self-explanatory to any first-person shooter fan, and really are COD 2 at its best. Deathmatch modes make the gameplay feel freer than most of the objective game types. Capture the Flag can be fun as a change of pace with a higher emphasis on team play, but its ridiculous 10-second respawn timer hurts the flow of the mode. I do, however, understand why the timer has to be so high. Slow movement speed and a lack of sprint means it takes longer to remove the flag from an enemy base. Headquarters can be fun as well, however, like a lot of the objective game modes, it can get a little too chaotic for my taste. Search and Destroy is probably the weakest mode in COD 2. Now, part of that may be personal preference, but always being attacker or defender for the whole match makes the mode drag a little. It can still be enjoyable as a slower paced type of mode, but it's certainly my least favorite on offer. COD 2 is primarily a deathmatch type game, but the 3 objective types on offer do add a little bit, even if they would not reach their heyday until later titles. Call of Duty 2 features 13 maps, and map control and knowledge is king in this game. Power positions and flanking routes are key, and veteran players will be able to use their understanding of the map to gain an upper hand. Old school arena map movement is also on display here, as tricks like crouch jumping and overall map mobility is emphasized and key to victory. What I find most impressive about COD 2's map design is its mix between slower paced and more frantic combat, not only between maps, but on the same combat arenas. The game seems to flow between the 2 paces well, ensuring that players never get burned out on CQB, but also ensuring that the game never gets too slow. The maps also do a very good job at being unique from one another, and while they do vary greatly in quality, playing maps with different styles, ranges, and paces make for a good experience. Now, I'm not saying that COD 2's map pool is amazing by any means. It pales in comparison to Halo 2 from the year prior or Battlefield 2 from the same year, and without spoiling too much, it's nowhere near the top of its own franchise. But it does set the groundwork impressively well for the gameplay style to come, and does work well within the confines of its own game. However, with a more bare-bones approach, there are some downsides. There is a noticeable lack of progression system that does hinder its ability to become more addictive and really grasp the player, begging them to come back for one more match. The lack of customization also hurts. I've never been someone that needs cosmetic customization in-game. However, with there being a lack of customization in the gameplay realm as well, matches can blend into one another. There just needed to be more room for player expression. I really wish there was more of a sandbox to dive into. There really just isn't enough customization, guns, weapons, or different gadgets or perks to really dive into here, and it can lead to the game getting stale pretty fast. Bare bones is definitely a good way to describe COD 2's multiplayer. With that being said, it is impressive how much the core design they were able to nail in the multiplayer realm. And as it stands, COD 2 can be a very enjoyable PvP experience when you can find enough players for a full match. Call of Duty 2 is a very important game in history. It stands as a very unique title, and to this day remains a game that doesn't feel as old as you would expect. It may be simple, but it captures the battlefield of the Second World War extremely well, and it's very fun to play. It's a simple game, and it is accessible and a monument to a simpler time in gaming, but it still has a decent amount of depth, and it's a little hard to score, especially against other games in the franchise, but I think 8 out of 10 is a fair assessment. After the successful launch of COD 2 was completed, Infinity Ward was finally granted permission to take their baby in a new direction.
Let's do this.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades. And the American Rangers began to climb. They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top, and in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe.